I don't know why I agreed to house sit for my cousin Jenny. I'd always found her cottage in the woods unsettling, and it wasn't like anyone else had volunteered. But she was headed out on a 2-week trip to Costa Rica and needed someone to keep an eye on things. She'd begged, even pleaded, and I finally caved in, telling myself it would only be for a couple of weeks. How bad could it be? Jenny's cottage was charming, in a way. It was tiny, practically buried in the woods with tall trees crowding close to it. She had it decorated in her own eclectic style, vintage furniture, and an endless collection of flea market finds that she called curiosities. Odd figurines, masks, mirrors with tarnished frames. They filled almost every corner. Walking through her place felt like stepping into a strange museum of things that didn't quite fit together. Even during the day, the cottage had this heavy, musty atmosphere, like it was keeping something hidden just under the surface. The first night was uneventful. I spent the evening scrolling through my phone, ignoring the quiet that felt too complete, too intense. Out here, away from any roads or streetlights, the silence became almost oppressive. Every time I thought I'd hear a car pass by, or the hum of city life, there'd be nothing. Just darkness and the occasional sigh of the trees outside. By the second night, though, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something felt off. It was around midnight, and I just started to drift off when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from inside the walls. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was a mouse or some other critter that had made its way in. The place was old, after all. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers up, hoping it would go away. But the scratching didn't go away. It grew louder, then softer, then louder again, almost like something was moving through the walls. It seemed to be coming from the wall just behind my headboard, right where I was trying to sleep. The sound had this erratic, restless energy to it, like whatever was making it was desperate, frantic. I turned on the bedside lamp and stared at the wall, half expecting to see something crawling through a crack, maybe even sticking a tiny paw or claw through the wallpaper. But there was nothing, just an old wall, covered in faded paint. Still, the scratching persisted, as if daring me to do something about it. Then, I heard something else, a faint, almost inaudible sound like shallow breathing, just behind the wall. I sat up, my skin prickling with unease. It wasn't the kind of sound that a rodent or small animal would make. This was human, or something that sounded terrifyingly close to human. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a trick of my mind. I was tired, in a strange place alone, but I couldn't sleep. That sound, scratching, then breathing, then silence, then scratching again. It stayed with me, replaying in my mind until the early hours of the morning. The next day, I found myself avoiding the house as much as possible. I went into town, wandered aimlessly through the aisles of a grocery store, lingered at a diner over a cup of coffee I didn't even want. Anything to delay going back to that cottage. But as the sun began to set, I had no choice. I returned, heart heavy with dread. That night, as I climbed into bed, I was almost holding my breath, waiting for the sound to start again. I felt foolish, like I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Then, right as the clock hit midnight, the scratching began again. This time it was louder, closer. It seemed to travel along the wall, moving steadily toward the door, then back, as if something was pacing inside the walls. I could feel my heartbeat speeding up, my palms beginning to sweat. I told myself I had to confront it, whatever it was. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped out of bed, and began following the sound, creeping through the hallway. The scratching was still there, but as I moved, it seemed to shift, almost like it was guiding me. The sound led me down the hallway toward Jenny's bedroom. She'd always kept her bedroom locked, and even when we were kids, she had never let me in there. But tonight, for some reason, the door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn back, to ignore it, but something drew me forward. I pushed open the door and shone my flashlight into the room. The first thing I noticed was how dark it was, almost unnaturally so. My flashlight barely seemed to cut through the blackness. And then, as I swept the light across the room, I saw the walls. They were covered in writing. Not paint, not ink, scratched into the very walls themselves. Words, phrases, some so faded they were barely legible. others carved deep into the plaster. I squinted, trying to make out what they said. "Help me. Let me out. They're watching." Those words were repeated over and over, covering the walls from floor to ceiling. My heart pounded harder as I realized they weren't random. They were desperate pleas, messages someone had carved into the wall in a frenzy, like they'd been trapped in there, desperate to escape. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a pile of old books stacked near the door. I'd had enough. I was going to leave, tell Jenny I couldn't do this. I turned, ready to bolt from the room, but then I noticed something else. A small door in the corner, almost hidden behind a heavy wardrobe. It was strange. I'd been in this house for 2 days and hadn't noticed that door before. It looked old, and I knew instantly it hadn't been opened in a long time. Against every bit of reason, I found myself drawn to it. I crouched down, twisted the handle, and opened the door. It creaked, revealing a narrow, steep staircase that disappeared into darkness below. Every bone in my body screamed that I shouldn't go down there, but it was as if something was calling to me, some force pulling me forward. I took a deep breath and began to descend, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air grew colder, thick with a musty metallic smell that made me gag. My flashlight flickered, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was stepping into a place I was never meant to see. In front of me was a small room, barely more than a closet, with stone walls and a single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, and in front of it a mirror. The mirror was huge, reaching almost to the ceiling, its surface clouded with dust and grime. I wiped at it, hoping to see my reflection, to remind myself that this was just an old, empty room. But as the dust cleared, I felt a jolt of nausea. My reflection stared back at me, but it looked wrong. It was me, but it wasn't. My face was stretched, twisted, my eyes dark and hollow, as if something had drained the life out of me. And then, without me moving, my reflection began to smile. A slow, sickening grin that spread across its face, mocking me. I stumbled backward, horrified, but my reflection didn't move with me. It stayed still, grinning that terrible grin. I turned to run, but the light bulb above me flickered, then went out, plunging me into darkness. And in that silence, I heard something, a whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "You can't leave." I bolted up the stairs, heart hammering as I burst back into Jenny's bedroom. I slammed the small door shut, trying to catch my breath. But as I turned to leave the room, my heart sank. The walls were no longer covered in faded writing. Instead, there was a single sentence scratched deep into the plaster, right above the bed. "I'm still here." I ran out of the room, down the hallway, and out of the house. I didn't care about the lights or locking the door. I just needed to get away. When I reached my car, I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. Just as I started the engine, I glanced back at the house. In the window, staring down at me, was my reflection. It was still grinning, those hollow eyes boring into mine as I sped away. I drove until I reached a cheap roadside motel. I didn't care about the condition of the place. I just needed somewhere that wasn't Jenny's house. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening, waiting, half expecting to hear the scratching in the walls again. The next morning, I called Jenny, telling her everything I'd experienced. She listened in silence, her voice quiet and somber when she finally responded. I'm sorry," she said. "I thought it would be fine, just for 2 weeks." "What are you talking about, Jenny?" I demanded. "What's wrong with that house?" She hesitated. "It's been in our family for generations," she said quietly, her voice laced with something between fear and regret. "The house, well, it has a reputation. I didn't think it would get this bad, but..." "What do you mean, reputation?" I demanded, my fingers clenching the phone so tightly it hurt. Jenny took a shaky breath. "It's hard to explain. My parents warned me about it when I was young, but I never really believed them. They said the house watches people, that it's alive in a way, that it has eyes." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's been called the House of Eyes for as long as anyone can remember." A shiver crept down my spine. "Eyes? What do you mean, eyes? It can see you through the walls, through the floors. It knows when you're scared, and it feeds off that fear. I thought I could handle it, keep it under control, but it's like it knows how to get to people, how to get inside their heads. I felt a wave of nausea. The breathing, the scratching, the messages on the walls. It all started to make a horrifying kind of sense. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, barely able to keep the anger from my voice. Why didn't you warn me about any of this? I thought it wouldn't bother you, she said softly. It usually only acts up when someone's been living there for a long time. I figured you'd be safe. I'm so sorry. There was a silence as her apology sank in, but there was something else I needed to know, something that had been haunting me since I'd left. Jenny, has anyone else seen reflections in the house? For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a trembling voice, she said, yes. It's one of the things that scared my parents the most. They told me the house has the power to take pieces of people. A reflection here, a shadow there. It starts small, almost like it's testing you. But the longer you stay, the more it collects. I felt a cold dread settle over me, as if ice was creeping into my bones. What happens if it takes all of you? I asked, voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. No one does. But there are stories of people who went into that house and were never the same after. People who lost something of themselves, piece by piece, until they just disappeared. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt a burning urge to get away, to put as much distance as I could between myself and that cursed house. But even as I thought that, a new fear gripped me. Jenny, do you think it could follow me? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I don't know, she said finally. But I think if it's taken something from you, it might try. It might not let you go so easily. I felt my skin go cold. I ended the call, not knowing what else to say, and spent the next few days in the hotel, sleeping fitfully and listening for any sign of the scratching. Every time I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror, I flinched, expecting to see that awful grin or those hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at me. Then, 3 days later, I got a call from Jenny. You need to come back, she said, her voice trembling. The house has changed. It's like it's waiting for something. What are you talking about? I asked, dread twisting in my gut. I can't explain it. Just please come back. I don't think I can face it alone. Against every instinct, I agreed. I drove back to her place, heart pounding the whole way. When I arrived, Jenny looked pale and shaken. She didn't even make eye contact as she led me inside. The house felt different, darker, heavier, like the air was pressing in on me from all sides. Jenny guided me through the rooms in silence, until we reached her bedroom. The writing on the walls was gone. In its place were drawings, hundreds of them, all of eyes. They stared down at us from every wall, ceiling, and corner, their gaze piercing, watching, waiting. Then I noticed something else. The small door in the corner, the one I'd gone through before, was open. This time, there was no hidden staircase behind it, just a black void, as if the doorway led to nowhere. I don't know how it happened, Jenny whispered. The house changes. It twists and turns, making new rooms and halls. I think it's alive. I think it's hungry. The door creaked open wider, and I felt an icy pull, almost like a whisper, urging me forward. No, I said, shaking my head. I'm not going back down there. But Jenny turned to me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I don't think you have a choice, she said. And as I looked into her eyes, I realized something was horribly wrong. Jenny's eyes weren't hers anymore. They were hollow, dark, almost like those of my reflection. Like something had taken them and left her with nothing. I backed away, heart pounding, but Jenny stepped closer. It wants you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wants you to finish what you started. I looked back at the doorway. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, like it was breathing, alive, waiting for me to step inside. I felt my feet moving forward, even as my mind screamed to stop. The pull was stronger now, irresistible. Jenny's voice echoed in my head, a whisper blending with the scratching and breathing that had haunted me for days. You can't leave. With one final, desperate glance at Jenny, I stepped through the doorway and into the darkness. The room beyond was silent, oppressive. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that I was back in the small stone room with the mirror. Only this time, the chair was occupied. Someone was sitting in it, head bowed, their face hidden in shadow. I felt a sickening sense of déjà vu as I approached. I knew, somehow, who it was before I even saw their face. It was me. The figure in the chair looked up, and I saw my own face staring back at me, hollow and lifeless, with that same twisted, mocking grin. My reflection, the one that had haunted me from the mirror. It leaned forward, smiling wider, and whispered, "Welcome home." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I felt myself being pulled forward, toward the chair, as if invisible hands were dragging me down. My reflection rose to meet me, and as our faces drew closer, I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I'd ever known. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting in the chair, staring into the mirror. My reflection was gone. I was alone, trapped in the darkness. But then, I heard it. The scratching, faint and desperate, coming from behind the walls. It's been days, maybe weeks. I don't know anymore. Time doesn't work the same way down here. All I know is that I can't leave. I'm trapped, just like the others who came before me. Sometimes, I hear Jenny's voice, whispering through the walls, telling me that it's okay, that I'm safe. But I know better. The house is watching, waiting, and one day, it will find someone else to take my place. Until then, all I can do is wait and scratch, leaving messages on the walls for whoever comes next. Help me.